Hey everybody, it's Yoli Medina, and I'm covering the Bryan Kohberger case, also known as the Idaho 4 case. And for those of you who are not familiar with the case, this is a case where Bryan Kohberger has been accused and is going to trial for the unaliving of 4 students, Kaylee Gonsalves, Maddie Mogan, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. These were 4 students that attended the University of Idaho, and they were unalived brutally on November 13th, 2022. And at this point in the case, Bryan Kohberger is to stand trial for the unaliving of these 4 students. And at the procedural point in this case, there was just a hearing, which was like 8 hours all day, on motions in limine. And that is to get an order from the judge to either exclude certain evidence because of certain things, or get a ruling in advance to admit certain evidence so that it doesn't have to be dealt with during trial and, cause pauses in the trial. And that's for the jury's sake. So what I wanted to talk about today is the notice of intent filed by the prosecution to introduce evidence of a traffic stop regarding Mr. Kohberger. This traffic stop was late at night or early morning hours of August 21st, 2022. And just keep in mind that the unalivings of the 4 students took place on November 13th, 2022. So the defense has filed a motion to exclude this traffic stop. And because they say, the defense, that it's prejudicial, it's not relevant, and it should be excluded. And so the prosecution says that they are noticing and they want to introduce this video to show Bryan Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra, and to show his identity, that he provided a driver's license to the officer, and it was a sheriff officer. It wasn't a Moscow Police Department officer. So they want to show for identity and ownership of the white Elantra. Now, I've always wondered about this traffic stop because it hasn't been released to the public, and Bryan Kohberger has been stopped by the police a total of 4 times from August 21st, 2022 to the middle of December 2022. And there was 1 traffic stop that was in Pullman, Washington, and 2 traffic stops were in Indiana in the middle of December, where he was traveling with his father during the Christmas break home to Pennsylvania, and they were driving. So he was stopped twice in Indiana on the route to his family home in Pennsylvania. He was stopped in Indiana, and there's a video body cam of those stops. There's also body cam of the stop in Pullman, Washington. And those 3 stops were during the day. And I didn't notice anything in particular about those stops. I mean, you can stop by the cops, you're going to be nervous, who knows. But in any event, the stops that were in Indiana, he didn't flee or anything. He had his father in the car. And the one video that hasn't been shown is the August 21st, 2022 traffic stop. And I know various creators have tried to get a copy of this traffic stop. And they were told, no, we're not going to release it because it would impede on a fair trial of the defendant. Something along those lines, that they weren't going to release it because it was prejudicial to the defendant. So in the hearings regarding this traffic stop, it was made known that Bryan Kohberger asked why the deputy sheriff wanted to look or wanted his phone number because he asked, well, why do you need my phone number? Because apparently the sheriff asked him for a phone number. And he asked, why do you need my phone number? I don't know. I think I would ask the same question, but I mean, I don't know until I'm in that position. So, and then he also, the reason for the stop was he was speeding and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And so another statement he made to the sheriff was, I don't know, seatbelts don't make a difference, or they're not as safe as people think they are, something along those lines. And please don't quote me. But he made a reference to seatbelts don't help very much, basically, in the car crash. And there may have been other statements, I don't know. So, the judge heard the arguments, and the defense has said, well, it could be prejudicial because he didn't want to give his phone number, and people may think that he's hiding something because he didn't want to give his phone number. And so the judge agreed and said, yes, we should redact that because that could be seen as prejudicial, that he's hiding something, and that would be prejudicial because this was on August 21st, 2022, and the unalivings happened in November 13th, 2022. So in any event, the judge was willing to redact certain things, and he got a little snippy. I mean, the judge says, well, isn't that the purpose of using this traffic stop is to identify the car? Because defense counsel had said, well, the jury is going to look at this video, they're going to see the car, and then they're going to look at the grainy video of the car that was driving around, or different cars or whatever, driving around the home, and they might make a connection that it's the car. And the judge got a little snippy, and he said, well, isn't that the point? Showing that he's the owner of the white car? And I didn't really care for that. And, I'm kind of immune to those kind of things with judges, because I go in front of judges, and if I took anything personal, or if I thought the judge was being rude or whatever, I mean, I could ruminate about it all day long. But you know what? I don't take those statements. I'm just, the judge's statements as personal, and I just argue my case. I don't care what the judge thinks. Well, I do care about what the judge thinks, but I'm there to argue my case. And so was Elizabeth Massoff. She was the one arguing this. And she said, it's prejudicial. So the judge sort of agreed with her. So the judge is going to look at this video, and he's going to make a determination as to what needs to be redacted from this video. And what was missing, I thought, I felt like jumping in there. What was missing is the location of the stop. I would have asked to preclude the exact location of the stop. And the reason is because there's still rumblings that Bryan Kohberger was surveilling this house where the 4 students were unalived, that he was stalking them in some way, and that he was really stalking them, but under Idaho law, it requires that the persons who are being stalked be aware of the fact that they are being stalked. And so I wanted to talk about that. So I have the Idaho stalking law that I want to go over, and let me put it up. Okay, so it's under malicious harassment, and it's Idaho Code Section 187906, stalking in the second degree. And number 1, it says a person commits the crime of stalking in the second degree if the person knowingly and maliciously engages in a course of conduct that seriously alarms, annoys, or harasses the victim, and is such as would cause a reasonable person substantial emotional distress, or engages in a course of conduct such as would cause a reasonable person to be in fear of death or physical injury, or in fear of the death or physical injury of a family or household member. And it says, as used in this section, course of conduct means repeated acts of non-consensual contact involving the victim or a family or household member of the victim, provided, however, that constitutionally protected activity is not included within the meaning of this definition. So in Idaho law, it is true that the person the person who is being stalked has to be aware and in distress of the stalking. And I've heard people say, well, he was stalking them, but under Idaho law, the victims have to be aware. In this case, they weren't aware because he was secretly stalking them and, running around and in his car around, following them or whatever. So I've heard that. Now, if people go back and look at the hearings regarding the motions to suppress, and this would be February 23rd, or was it January 23rd hearings, Detective Mowry testified that he was being CC'd on emails that the FBI was receiving regarding the FBI's stalking investigation into Bryan Kohberger. And if you don't believe me, just go back to that. I don't have the timestamp, but if you go back to those hearings, it's toward the end, maybe the last 20 minutes, 30 minutes of the hearing. And Detective Mowry says, when questioned about an email, he says, I was being CC'd on these emails because the FBI had an ongoing investigation into Bryan Kohberger, or a current investigation into Bryan Kohberger at that time. So the FBI was investigating Bryan Kohberger for stalking, and there is a difference in between the law in Idaho and the federal law. So now I want to show you the federal law. And by the way, I did do a video on the federal stalking law, a general video, and I'll post that in the description box so you can see it. Now here is domestic violence and stalking. This is a federal law, and it's code or section 2261A, interstate stalking. Now we know Bryan Kohberger lived in Washington and the crimes were committed in Idaho, Moscow, Idaho. So I'm going to read this. Whoever travels in interstate or foreign commerce or within the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States, or enters or leaves Indian country with the intent to kill, injure, harass, or intimidate another person, and in the course of or as a result of such travel places that person in reasonable fear of the death of or serious bodily injury to that person, a member of the immediate family of that person, or the spouse or intimate partner of that person, and then there's a semicolon, or travels in interstate foreign commerce with the intent, and that's number 2, to kill or injure a person in another state or tribal jurisdiction or within the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States. Okay, so I just read that to you. The federal stalking law does not require that the person who is being stalked know or be in fear of being stalked. It focuses, one part of it, this law focuses on the intent of the individual who crosses state lines to unalive someone. So the feds were investigating this. Let's stop sharing this. The feds were investigating this, and they had a grand jury. And how do we know that? Because Bryan Kohberger was served with the federal grand jury subpoena, and that's how the defense knew that there was a federal grand jury. And it was regarding stalking. And Detective Mowry admitted it on the stand on the motion to suppress hearings when he was questioned on the stand. And if you don't believe me, please go back and look at that video. I just didn't have time to find that portion and put it up here, but he did testify to that. And there was a federal grand jury subpoena that was referenced by defense counsel and has been referenced in motions to compel those subpoenas in previous hearings. So the feds could have charged Bryan Kohberger with stalking under the federal stalking law, but they haven't. So there are no stalking charges against Bryan Kohberger in the state case, the case currently against him. There's only burglary and 4 murder charges. And for people who think that he was surveilling them or he was planning or he was doing things, I don't know if he was or not. But if there was evidence that he was surveilling them to eventually unalive these students or one of the students that he focused on, then the feds would bring a case against him. And they haven't. And the feds have a really good track record of convicting persons they charge. They have like a 90% conviction rate. And yet they did not bring those charges against Bryan Kohberger. So the other thing is the state has elected not to use certain surveillance video, even though they said they were going to use it. And they filed a motion that these videos were self-authenticating. And after the defense filed a motion precluding or opposing what the prosecution wanted to use in terms of the video evidence, the prosecution said, oh, we don't need certain videos. We don't need those. We can put those aside. So I assume, and maybe it's a reasonable assumption, maybe it's not, but those are videos that were going to be used in the federal case. If there was going to be a federal case, there isn't a federal case for stalking. There isn't a state case for stalking. And you better believe it. If the feds had evidence to be able to prove that he was stalking these victims, they would bring a case against him. But they haven't. And so this mysterious traffic stop, one of the things I wish would have been brought up is, yeah, okay, you can use it for his identity. He showed the driver's license. He showed that he owned the car. That's it. Exclude the location of where he was stopped. Because I would do that because I would think that the prosecution is still going to want people to think, oh, he was planning it, even though their notice of intent says it was for identification of the car and identification of Bryan Kohberger. But that still leaves out the fact that it was in Moscow, Idaho, and I really don't know how close it was to the house, but you have, it could be argued this was so many yards or miles away from the house, and there's just no reason to have the location of that stop other than that it was in Moscow, Idaho, to be told to the jury. And I feel strongly about this because I'm a legal person, although I'm not a criminal defense attorney, I'm a legal person. And when somebody is not charged with a crime, they should not be accused of that crime. If there was evidence, yes, but there isn't. And the reason I know there isn't is because there's no charge under Idaho law for stalking. There's no charge against Bryan Kohberger for federal stalking. So whatever people think he was doing by driving around, I don't know, but he could have been driving around because the shopping is better in Moscow. I mean, I know of a creator who went to Moscow because the shopping is better. They give you bags. Whereas in Pullman, Washington, they don't give you bags. You got to hold it in you're like a kangaroo. You have to hold all your stuff. I mean, if you don't bring a bag. So there's plenty of reasons why people would want to go to Moscow to do certain things. And I understand that this was late at night. And again, people who have anxiety disorders sometimes drive around at night because it's soothing. And like I've always said, there's a reason why people take babies who are colicky. They take them in the car, they put them in the car, and they drive around, and then eventually they fall asleep. The babies fall asleep. And then I've known people like that. I actually see people, when I used to walk my dog, I would see, white under Elantra, of all things, with the baby screaming in the back and the windows down in the summer, driving around the neighborhood. And a couple of times. And, because the baby was colicky, So I just don't like that that's portrayed as something that Bryan Kohberger was doing, that he was stalking. Let's just stick to the burglary, which means putting him at the house and entering the house without consent and unaliving the 4 students. And I feel like this whole case has a lot of circumstantial evidence around the unalivings, but there's no evidence putting Bryan Kohberger, his physical person, not some DNA which could be argued that it's transfer DNA or touch DNA, or there was enough DNA, there was a single source DNA. Without that, exclude that, there's no evidence of his person, Bryan Kohberger, going into that house, period. His person going into that house and coming out having unalived these people. The murder weapon has never been found. And they have this white car driving around, which is not conclusive. You need an expert, FBI vehicle identification expert, to identify the car. And even still, I can't see. I mean, they just look like white cars. And when I say that a jury who might likely have some elderly people in the jury, because they're retired and they can sit for a jury for 3 months. So I can assume that some of those jurors might be elderly. They might want evidence of a license plate or something like that. And they're not going to get it. They're going to get this white car, and they're going to have an expert tell them that this is a white Elantra and that Bryan was in it when there's no evidence or something showing that he was in it, and that he parked, and that he went in the house, and that he did this unalivings, and then he got back in his white car, and then he took off. So they're going to tell you all these things about how he purchased a knife back in, January or March of 2022, which was almost a year before the crimes, or 9 months before the crimes. They're going to tell you he purchased a balaclava mask, which lots of people purchase in the winter in Pennsylvania. And, there's just nothing everything seems to be remote, including this August 21st, 2022 traffic stop, which has been a mystery because we haven't seen it. And all the other traffic stops we have seen. So this is just my little pitch to tell people that, look, the law, whether you like it or not, in the United States, and the jury will be instructed as to the law, that Bryan Kohberger is presumed to be innocent until the state can prove him guilty. And that's the law in the United States. So if you are in the United States, you should be aware of that law. And while you may have opinions, that's fine. But to conclusively say that Bryan Kohberger did this crime is trampling over the U.S. Constitution and the law. It's one thing to have an opinion, and I respect that. People can look at Bryan Kohberger and they can say, yeah, he did it. I think he did it. I think he did it. But to say he did it conclusively, I'm skeptical of people who say that, because that's not what we're here to do. And I understand these 4 victims, they didn't deserve to die the way they did. And if Bryan Kohberger is guilty of this, then he needs to go to prison and he needs to get his penalty. But we don't know that conclusively. And for those people who know that Bryan Kohberger did it, they better cough up the evidence that he did it. Otherwise, you can have an opinion that he did it. I mean, yeah, that's free speech. But anyway, those are my thoughts. I know I went on a rant, but I had to, because I still hear people talking about stalking, and it's just like, oh, no. You can have an opinion that he was stalking, but to say that Bryan Kohberger was stalking, no, there's no evidence of it. If there were, the prosecution in Idaho would have brought stalking charges and the feds would have charged him with federal stalking. Anyway, those are my thoughts. And I'm glad I got it off my chest because it bothers me.